It's my pleasure this morning to introduce our special guest speaker, Donna Ashworth. Donna Ashworth is an author, Arizona native, a fifth-generation Westerner, and a great-granddaughter of wagon train pioneers. Donna received her degrees in history and literature from Arizona State University. Go Devils. Yeah. After my alma mater too, I had to say it. After 15 years of teaching high school English and humanities, she resigned from the public schools to become a seasonal fire lookout on the Coconino National Forest. In the quarter century she spent on the mountaintops, and I think she was up there with her husband, who's also here this morning, she wrote the Small Mountain Quartet. And as part of the quartet, the Biography of a Small Mountain is both a geological account of Woody Mountain and a cross-section of Flagstaff history. So we're very honored to have her here this morning. Donna, come on up.
The beginning was really quite late. After an inland arm of the sea rose and fell several times over the long geologic ages, leaving sediment several hundred feet deep. After all the deposits in the Grand Canyon had been laid down, there were dinosaurs here 100 million years ago. The Colorado Plateau rose a mile into the air. There was movement on the Oak Creek Fault. Volcanoes were all over the neighborhood 5 or 6 million years ago. Ice ages. And finally, there was a low place here. Shallow as a soup bowl, with no exit for rainwater or snowmelt, except straight down into unseen faults. In summer it was a square mile of meadow, boggy in the middle. It's one of only 3 natural lakes in Arizona, bigger than Stoneman Lake, smaller than Mormon Lake, which we call Mormon Lake because there was once a dairy farm there. Ponderosa pine came and went and came back with the climate, but these big trees don't grow in wet ground, even ground that dries out in the summer. So there are places like this all over the forest, meadows among the trees. After another long stretch of time, there were people on the plateau. Natives, we call them, because they've been here so long. But we found no evidence of residence at the lake. No sign that they ever came here to stay. Forest Service archaeologists have identified a spot on the east shore where they sat to chip away at glassy black basalt from the top of Woody Mountain to fashion arrow points for hunting. It would have been a good place for hunting. If they had a name for the lake, we don't know it. The first men of European ancestry, the first men we have any record of, any written record, arrived in 1851, only 162 years ago. 53 men, 137 mules, and 40 sheep in an official exploring expedition under the command of Captain Lorenzo Sid Greaves and Brevet Major H.L. Kendrick. Their guide was 50-year-old Antoine Leroux. The party included Richard Kern, an artist and map maker, and Samuel W. Woodhouse, a doctor, the first naturalist to visit northern Arizona. There were wolves and grizzly bears in the forest then. black man was in the party, the camp cook, Moses Gibson, and several men of Mexican descent who had been hired in New Mexico as mule drivers. One of them, Inemacio Valdez, had been struck on the head by a rock during an argument with another man 4 days earlier. They camped for the night on the north shore of the lake, which was mostly dry. It was October 15th, cold at night, barely above zero. The next morning, Inemacio Valdez was unconscious. Dr. Woodhouse thought because of damage to his brain, a blood clot maybe, due to that rock that had been thrown at him. But at any rate, he was unable to travel. So the Kendricks party stayed here for 5 days until Valdez died. They buried him at the foot of a large pine and named the place Laguna Inemacio, a detail that was soon forgotten. Far as I know, no one has ever discovered the grave. Beverly, do you know whether any of your family ever did?
No, I don't.
Never found the grave. He's still there then.
I heard the story just now.
Surveyors and explorers, prospectors, trappers were in the area for the next 20 years or so, vanguard of a growing exodus from the continent's east coast. If any of them came into this seasonal lake southwest of a big volcano, they left no record. Herds of cattle and sheep were driven onto the plateau during the 1870s for the grass. During that decade, when cattle ranges were not fenced or assigned by permits, a stock raiser named Charles T. Rogers drove his animals into the shallow basin here for summer pasture. Federal census records for Arizona Territory for 1880 identify him as a man 51 years old, born in Maine, a resident of Yavapai County. Coconino County did not exist until Yavapai County was divided in 1891, and Rogers apparently lived, at least in the winter months, in Prescott, in a boarding house. But there is evidence that he had, or thought he had, lands near Williams, and he had his cattle here long enough for his name to be used as identification. Rogers Lake. After the American Civil War, railroads moved west across the continent on 3 different routes. The one in the middle came across Arizona Territory. Just south of a big volcano where there were springs, railroads needed water in those years of steam-powered locomotives, and forests of trees that could be made into ties for the tracks. Flagstaff was created by that railroad in 1882, and men from the little settlement began to ride out to Rogers Lake to shoot deer, ducks, whatever was here in the way of food. Sometimes, so many of them, the newly established newspaper reported, it's a wonder they didn't shoot each other. It also mentioned a man hunting out here, probably sleeping on the ground, who had been bitten on the lips and face by a skunk. Some of the meat was food for loggers and men who worked at the sawmill operated by the logging company that cut ties for the railroad. It was soon bought by the 3 Reardon brothers, who became leading citizens of Flagstaff in every way you could think of, and had the first big mechanical effect on Rogers Lake. In 1887, their company built a branch sawmill at the lake, employing 50 men working day and night, that cut 15,000 feet of timber a day that was hauled on wagons pulled by oxen to the end of the logging railroad a few miles away. Before long, there were a road and a telephone line into town, and enough men in residence for the operation at the lake to be considered a county precinct. The branch sawmill wasn't here long. The big mill in town burned, and everything was moved back to Flagstaff. Do any of the millers, have you ever found any trace that that branch sawmill was here?
I don't know. I wish Dwayne was here because he could tell you, because he was here, you know, as a little boy in 1933 and we played. I'll ask him and get back.
Okay, thank you.
I think so. I think there's...
Trees remained on level land, fairly level land, south of the lake, so logging went on. The evidence we have of it is plain to see. That long, straight line that cuts across, clear across the east side of the lake and into the forest, it looks like it might have been a dike to hold water back from the road. But there are cuts in it here and there. It was the bed for the logging railroad, the narrow gauge logging railroad, built of dirt, brought in and mounded up to keep the tracks out of the water in the spring. When the crash of falling trees finally ended early in the 1930s, those tracks were pried up. Some went into town. Others were used to fashion cattle guards. Next time you drive over one, look and see. Sure enough, railroad tracks on some of them. There's another sure sign that loggers operated here years ago. Look at the trees. It was more convenient, more practical at first to take everything. And all the pines were cut in the expectation that the forest would grow back by itself. It didn't. In 1904, an agreement was signed between the San Francisco Mountain Forest Reserve and Arizona Lumber and Timber Company to control logging practice, and required that all pines under 11 inches in diameter were to be left standing, and 2 trees per acre larger than 14 inches were to be left to provide seed. The forest still didn't regenerate. Not until the weather in 1918, 1919 was favorable. You can recognize the situation immediately. Pines you drive past anywhere in the county that you could reach around with both arms. Trees with dark bark germinated in 1919. That's most of them. If you see one that is yellow-brown or the color of an Irish setter and way too big to reach around, it was here when the Kendrick-Sitgreaves party came through. Maybe when Coronado came into this new world in the 16th century. Maybe even before the first English colonies on the Atlantic coast. A few homesteaders tried to make a go of it out here, although it was not an easy place to live in the winter. Joe Chavez will agree with that. Right, Joe? He was there a minute ago. They couldn't get out in the winter. They couldn't go anywhere in the winter. Most of the people moved into town. By the early 1890s, pioneer ranchers Dorsey and Kelsey had headquarters on the North Shore with houses and corrals, thus D.K. Ranch. In 1909, the new Forest Service built a ranger station, big enough for 1 or 2 men, near a spring on the West Shore, to be used as summer headquarters for the Rogers Lake District, part of what was called a Special Protective Force. They were expected to climb to the top of Woody Mountain now and then to look for smoke. For the first 2 years, they had no telephone into Flagstaff for reporting fire, so if they spotted one, they rode their horses to put it out themselves. When the first noisy automobiles came into use by rangers, there was no longer a need to position ranger stations 20 miles apart, and the site at Patterson Spring was abandoned. 15 years ago, when I went looking for it, there were still stones piled up and broken dishes on the ground. Ben, when you were exploring, did you ever see any trace of that station?
I think so, yeah.
I should mention the gold in Rogers Lake. People have come out here with backhoes and diving equipment and all kinds of tools and expectations, hoping to find it. But the only person who ever realized any money was a local writer named Gladwell Richardson, who was not above telling a stretcher now and then if it improved true fiction. He sold the story to True Treasure Publications, which printed it in 1967 and again in 1973 under the title Rogers Lake Loot. Here's the story, just as Richardson told it. In 1881, 2 outlaws stole from a mining company on the Agua Fria River 8 bars of gold, 3 feet long and 4 inches square, weight 70 pounds each, and loaded them onto 2 big Missouri mules. They drove those mules across the Verde Valley, up the Mooney Trail out of Oak Creek Canyon, through 12 miles of forest to the south shore of Rogers Lake, where they stopped because they found a deserted cabin, which they moved into. Later, they robbed a stagecoach of $25,000 of gold and silver coin and attracted attention spending freely in saloons in Flagstaff. They fled their Rogers Lake cabin one jump ahead of a posse, but first they put their loot into the lake for safekeeping. Walking out on the ice, they chopped a hole and dropped the gold bars and silver into deep water. One of the men was killed in a bar brawl in Holbrook. The other spent 24 years in Yuma Territorial Prison and was too old and crippled by gunshot wounds when he got out to find that lost gold and silver. Richardson concluded by saying, "It is surprising how many stock bells, horseshoes, tin cans, and other metal objects have been dug up, but so far, no one has hit the jackpot. The gold is still there for the finding." Deep water? In winter? Never mind, people just love to believe in lost treasure. They came out from all over the country in search of it. Chavez, Bob and Pat, you might see some of them now and then prowling around here, prowling around on the South Shore. For 20 years I worked as a fire lookout in a tower up on Woody Mountain. Every day during those years I looked down to Rogers Lake. I've seen it in the spring when water was so high that it blocked Road 231 for a while, and sailboarders were skimming across the surface. One day in late summer, I stood up there and watched men with Geiger counters gridding across the South Shore, hoping to find gold coins. In summer, cattle grazed, and cloud shadows moved over, and the margins turned yellow with blooming coreopsis. Once a college-age boy, high on something, ran around for a few hours, throwing up his arms, turning circles, falling on his back in the grass.
I'm better now.
And the Miller family, the Millers, have been here since the 1930s. 80 years. Longer than anybody, ever.